I would like to invite the Chief of Lac-Simon-Nishnawbek Nation, Adrien Jérôme, pour des mots d'ouverture. Chef.
Bonjour à tous. Merci de m'avoir invité. Gawin daznan sabnaman. Adrien Jérôme de Genkas. Uma coisa mosaïque. Saïgin Genkat Gadegin Gajika. Saïgin Maga. Chimigwat's Knayo. Aginden music, no make cheesy gizic, extimini gizic. Kijende Muniquend de Genkas. Wagon do them. Wagon Kituasa, giving a bamboo touch. Bika. Miguch. J'aimerais remercier, c'est un honneur pour moi de.
I'd like to thank you. It's an honor for me to say a few words to you and to say a prayer, because for women, water is very important. It's life. Our babies are in water for, we carry them bear them before they are born as well, for 6 months, and our Mother Earth is made up of water, and we need water as well for our 7 next generations. As you see, it's spring is coming, grandmother is coming, grandfather is winter is leaving, so grandmother is here to give us the seeds that allow all the everything to grow, all the wonders that grow during the summer, and to allow the animals to reproduce as well, and to have water in their bellies as well. This is a great teaching for us that water has. It's very important in our daily lives, for the earth and all the living species, including human beings. And grandfather, the winter is leaving us, and grandfather winter, who covered the ground with his white blanket to allow Mother Earth to rest. Kichimigwech, thank you very much. And thanks for being concerned with water for our 7 future generations and our great grandchildren and the 7 generations after them, to allow them to perpetuate the Anishinaabe, or the indigenous person who is in us. It is our duty to protect everything that's on earth. Kichimigwech. And I'll start to doing my prayer, but it will be in my language, so no translation for this part.
Ego bege, keninet kpiodemak, aki. Nibisa, nibi magawini madziwin. Jibagin jik cabbage, gdoj madzak. Gdoj madzach, nijanishnam. Gidokushnam. Minshnam sensatadwin. Minshnam squeeziwin. Wedi. Ego beg piodemak. Nibi. Kin magaye digagi. Kay desichkin. Nibi. Gdojum nosha ketsigi. Gdojum taigi kanigego. Mima eojum mad. Eojadaguk madziwin. nibi. Ikweo midok shag de sigizes madzewina. Ewina shatwesizak. Umeo do no kinna. Jojum nana ki. Umeo don shachkewina kinna. Anibina. Imagagewin imagine toigen na kanegeguna. Eminwak, egigendem wigwak. Kadojum madza. Chimigwach kadananum. Jesus. Ebi wasiatuk. Kadojum Emi diak kadojum natsatadiak. Chimigwach. Merci.
Merci, Chef Jérôme. J'aimerais tourner au...
Thank you, Chief Jerome. I'd like to ask Regional Chief Ghislain Picard for a few opening words. Hello.
Oh, Irving will go to Regional Chief Ghislain Picard.
Donc, ça,
Bonjour, Chef Régional.
Don't have any problems, Irvin, giving you my spot.
Well, I was just thanking the elder in my language, which
Non, ben, écoutez, je sais que
I know that it's less obvious to navigate from English or French to English because of the system. So I will just address you in French if you allow me.
Ça m'écarte un peu de mes habitudes là,
I go away from my habits of going between three languages when it's possible and in person. It's another reality that allows us to do it easily, but it's not the case this morning. Mathieu, it's been a long time since we haven't seen each other, and it's nice to see you after all this time. It's been a few years, eh? Happy to see that you're here to facilitate for tomorrow.
D'abord, reconnaître et remercier la chef Adrienne Jérôme qui...
First of all, I'd like to thank Chief Adrienne Jérôme, who is really sharing a wonderful and a deep teaching with us this morning on the role that the environment plays and also our role as human beings to look after the earth for its continuity, and that thanks for emphasizing this role we have to play. And it makes me think, because when you talk, these teachings are our own, and we don't choose them. They belong to us. And I have some grandchildren, one who's 13 years old, and she always reminds me of my responsibility as an adult and my responsibility towards water. And it's important for us to learn a lesson from everything we observe, we hear, we see around us. And I think it'll be important. It's important to mention it and acknowledge it this morning. I'd say that we're in a period that's very heavy, very busy, and also very demanding for defending our positions as First Nations people. Yesterday, we started a reflection that was very important on the issue of safety within our communities. We are committed. We want to commit ourselves with the federal government on the tabling of a bill to recognize Indigenous police forces as an essential service. And we didn't come up with this yesterday. We've been asking for this for a long time. So we would like to have there was a national program in the 90s which failed in its task to make Indigenous police forces and public safety more autonomous. We are preparing an important meeting with Mr. Legault next Friday. These are the chiefs of Quebec. We're trying to set up a political table with the Quebec government. If not, if there's no political process, it remains at the status quo. But one thing that we will certainly insist upon is the responsibility we have towards ourselves and towards our population, which is to have a greater autonomy. That's also important. And there are other aspects that we think different recent events take place. Once again in Joliette, there are events that really shed light on an extremely important challenge that I won't call impossible, but nonetheless, it is ridden with obstacles when we are fighting in our fight against racism and discrimination. So this is the political backdrop, but it's also the human context. Why am I talking about this? Because through this, we have to find time to talk about issues that will be like the ones we'll be discussing today and tomorrow. By saying that if we compare ourselves, we can perhaps find consolation because for water management, out of all, with all respect due to the other regions, but I would say that Quebec, nonetheless, is well situated when we talk about management of its water. But this being said, we can't say we've reached the ideal level. There are many challenges before us, especially in a context. We heard Minister Miller to make a public statement on their intentions 6 years ago, and how much they've fallen short of these objectives that they've set 6 years ago. So there are situations of concern. There are urgent situations in other regions too. And I'm talking about this, and yes, we will support them. We will show solidarity for emergency situations in other First Nations communities. But this should not also be the result that this shouldn't be a reason to pay less attention to our region, especially when we talk about the context where there could be a legislative framework that can be updated on clean water, on safe drinking water. So we have to send the essential signals. Yes, we can do this, the AFNQL and the chiefs at the table, but it's also essential that you, as participants this symposium, that you put everything on the table regarding your experience and what you know, to give yourself the right tools for your sustainable development projects. And I'd also like to mention the close collaboration between the Sustainable Development Institute and the Assembly of First Nations for the holding of this forum. And the challenges and the next steps is to see how we'll integrate a process targeting the tabling of a bill like we're doing with police services. It might be a bit exaggerated, but since we've got the wind at our sails, we've got C92, C91, C15, which was deposited last December. So there will perhaps be a C something for police services and maybe a bill for the question of drinking water. So I think we should seize this opportunity. In the political environment, there's no mystery about this. In Canada, we've got an unstable environment. At any moment, we could end up with federal elections called. But once again, in the meantime, your contribution is very important, and I'd even say essential. So I wish everyone a great session today, and I think I'll come back and see you tomorrow according to your availability. So thank you very much, everyone. See you later, Adrien. Thanks again, Mathieu. Yep, see you later.
Thank you, Regional Chief. I'd like to go to the Director of the First Nations of Quebec and Labrador Sustainable Development Institute for some opening remarks, Michael Ross.
Thank you very much. I'll be brief on my side. I want to get things going here, but thanks everybody again. It's great to see so many of you come this morning for the meeting. Again, water is such an important aspect for First Nations. We haven't done a lot of work at the Institute on Water, but it's something that was identified as a priority when we did a survey with First Nations in Quebec. So we'll definitely be looking forward to adding on to that theme in the following years coming up. So again, very happy to be here this morning, and I want to thank everybody and have a good meeting today.
Thank you, Michael. We had you scheduled for 20 minutes. No, I'm just
That's way too much. I'm a man of few words usually, so I just want to get things done. So very happy to get going.
Well, let's keep up with that theme then, Michael. Thank you very much. What I'd like to do is go a little bit over our agenda in terms of how we're going to proceed through the day today, just so that we all are kind of getting prepared on how we're going to be going into breakout groups. We'll have French breakout groups and English breakout groups. So I want to go through the process to make sure we kind of have an idea on how it's going to unfold. So the process will be a presentation from the Assembly of First Nations, basically an overview of the conversation they've had previously on 5 subject areas. The 5 subject areas being rights and responsibilities, water governance, transboundary governance, funding, and standards and regulations. So those are the 5 areas we'll be exploring. We'll have a presentation to outline what has been the conversation so far on each of the topic areas. Once we get an overview of that topic, we'll go into breakout groups. We'll be shared with a consideration, a question for us to all to consider as we go into breakouts. We'll go into breakouts. We'll hear an expert video. So we have 5 videos or 5 movies for you to show, and we'll have them in English, and I think they're dubbed in French, so we'll be able to hear them both in the language of your choice. Within the breakout groups, we will be asked 2 or 3 questions for the Menti poll, and during the breakouts, you'll be able to actually go on the poll, share your opinion, yes, no, maybe, in terms of the questions that are posed to you. We also have a bubble question or a word bubble question, and that will be kind of the conversation we'll have in breakouts. We'll ask you that question. We'll have a brainstorming session. We have technicians on the side who are putting up keywords of the conversation. And just so everyone knows, we are recording for the report, and all the sessions will have note takers so that we'll get the details of your conversation in the report. We won't necessarily have the chance in this session to hear from everybody on the breakout session. So we'll do the word bubble. And then once we're done that, hopefully we'll have a break, usually between each one of them. So we'll come back to plenary after the session. We'll share the poll results. We'll share the word bubble results, and then we'll move on to the next agenda item, the next topic, again, having an AFN representative give us an overview. We will pose the question to you. We'll go into breakouts. We'll have a film. We'll have the questions. We'll do the word bubble, and we'll come back to plenary, and we'll do that 5 times. So thankfully, we're virtual. We don't have to walk to different meetings, because that would be a lot of walking between here and another meeting room in the back here. This way we can be sedentary and eat lots of food. I hear is very good for you. So with that, I would like to start. One other, ce que je vais essayer de faire, c'est de faire
What I'll try to do is I'll try to do the afternoon in French. So we'll start in English, and then we'll let the Francophones have a break for their headsets and the interpretation. Don't
in the afternoon, give our Francophone delegates an opportunity to take off their headphones if they have, or they can actually listen to the conversation as opposed to translation. So with that, I'd like to invite Irving LeBlanc, who is Director of Housing, Infrastructure, and everything that one might consider building. I think that's his title. To do our first overview, which is, or is it yourself, Bing, or will it be with yourself and Delaney?
I'll start, Matthew, and then Delaney will take over.
Perfect. The floor is yours.
Can't see the floor though.
It's been years since I've seen the floor.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, generally, we do start with a slide. Good morning, everyone. Bonjour à tous. Bienvenue, everyone. Welcome, Ani. Bing lamlagin indishna kas weekwem kong dunjba. Dawa andodem. Dawa daw mi gizi indodem. Weekwem kong dunjba. Gani. Mi wachman pi give shaik nunga. We be about the mongmanda and the beach. The be. Mi wach nina. Ma bagabagi that Adrian, Jerome, thank you for your words. Elder, I also want to thank Regional Chief Picard. I'm sure they were good words. Unfortunately, I didn't have time to turn on my French earphones, but very well. I'm sure they were all good. To me, which for that. Today, we want to talk about the Safe Drinking Water for First Nations legislation. And it's about taking stock of where we are, where we've been. And we have been doing this for some time already. We have been to Quebec a few times for the water legislation and also the operation maintenance discussion, changes to operation maintenance policy. Those two subjects are very related, and the next engagement will be talking about the long-term drinking water strategy. All of those three are intrinsically related to the work that needs to be done, with the end goal to make sure every member has access to safe drinking water and adequate sanitation treatment of the water that we use. Also, to talk about, as you go further, making sure that there's sustainable, predictable funding for First Nations to manage, operate their water systems, not only water systems, wastewater, but also in the long run, something we'll touch on later on today or tomorrow, the closing the infrastructure gaps for 2030. So next slide, please. Oh. My apologies, I have to switch over to my large screen. I didn't bring my magnifying glass on my little laptop, so. So where we are today is to give you a little bit of background on the Safe Drinking Water for First Nations Act. Those of you who have been following it, it has been in force. It's currently in force. It was put into force in November 2013. 48 years have passed. No regulations have been developed, and it's for good reason. The act was created and brought into force without consultation, despite extensive First Nations resistance and challenges. Some of the objections were that there was no consultation, obviously. First Nations were not adequately consulted because it was brought into the Senate. It was a Senate bill, and the Senate bill does not require identification how that bill is going to be funded. So it was very clear that there were no resources identified to implement the legislation. And also it did not respect First Nations rights, First Nations water rights, and everything else that goes with it. So in spite of that, the federal government continued with their discussions in 2017, proceeded till September 2017, proceeded with modifications to that in spite of the objections, despite calls for those engagements to cease by First Nations. The federal government has made clear commitments to ensure First Nations have equity with non-First Nations in terms of water quality and standards and equity in water access. In 2017-2018, they acknowledged that a First Nations-led process to deal with the current legislation is needed. What is important to point out there that the first round of legislation that the government developed and thrust upon us without consultation, they kept reminding us that it's not about rights, it's not about treaties, it's not about your water rights, it's about health and safety. And they maintain that. That try to go through it. Well, it's just about standards, regulations, and not about our rights. So next slide, please. Oh, sorry. So during the all this time, as we always mention that anything that we do at the Assembly of First Nations is directed, and we get our mandate from resolutions which are passed by the Chiefs in Assembly or First Nations in Assembly. And we have so far 4 AFN resolutions that were passed on safe drinking water related matters in 2017, 2018. And previous to that, we have numerous resolutions related to water. So these 4 reflected substantial results of sustained First Nations advocacy, which shifted the approach of the federal government on the Safe Drinking Water Act. Resolution 26, 2017, Safe Drinking Water for First Nations Act, repeated the call for repeal of the Safe Drinking Water Act and immediate cessation of federal government's engagement sessions for amendment of the Act, and instead call for the federal government to develop in partnership with First Nations the next steps in engaging with the Safe Drinking Water for First Nations Act. So so we're happy to say we're in a discussion now, and the federal government's also using the terminology repeal of the Safe Drinking Water Act and starting over. Next slide. Resolution 88, 2017, First Nations-led engagement process for safe drinking water legislation directed the Assembly of First Nations to establish a joint working group comprised of AFN Chiefs Committee on Housing Infrastructure, their regional technicians, federal representatives, legal counsel for AFN, and the federal government and other experts as necessary to co-develop a draft framework for new legislation. Those components that we need to set up is essentially to mirror what we expect the federal government to have. They will have their experts. They will have their mini experts on their side. They will have their technicians. They will have their lawyers. They will have their policy people. So we need to be able to meet them on a level footing to be able to have a fair discussion on this. Resolution 1, 2018, First Nations-led process to develop new federal safe drinking water legislation took this even further, mandated AFN to immediately communicate to the federal government that in keeping with government's commitments to reconciliation with First Nations, a joint legislative co-development process and mandate will proceed with full partnerships with First Nations, including the development of a joint working group on safe drinking water for First Nations. So the act is no longer in the in the language here anymore. We're moving forward. And this gave further support, gave or strengthened what the previous in the resolution was. Next slide, please. So our response, as is our role at the Assembly of First Nations, the sectors, our role, responsibility is to respond to the resolutions and implement them and put them up, operationalize them. So the development of a Chiefs Committee on First Nations Safe Drinking Water legislation, drafting of the First Nations Safe Drinking Water preliminary concepts, presented those preliminary concepts to the Chiefs Assembly in Vancouver in July 2018. And from that, Resolution 26, 2018, support of a First Nations Safe Drinking Water legislation preliminary concepts, which mandated us to provide the mandates for preliminary concepts as a working document to support engagement. And we'll be revisiting those again today. Directs the AFN to proceed with national engagement to develop new safe drinking water legislation. And this is where we are today. Also thank the regional water coordinators in Quebec for arranging the pre-engagements, so to provide us with some pre-information to get into these new discussions, and directs the AFN to advocate for co-development of this legislation in a manner that affirms and ensures First Nations rights, interests, aspirations, inherent rights and laws, standards, guidelines, and processes are protected. So we're moving quite a ways forward from the original act, which we were told only about standards and regulations, not about rights. In 2019, we held engagements across the country to further discuss the key elements of the proposed repeal and replace, And the main topics that were covered is rights and responsibilities, water governance, transboundary issues, financing, and standards for the provision of water and sanitation. Next slide. So what's our next steps in the short term, in the next 3 to 6 months? Finalize the terms of reference for the joint working group, and that's well underway for the safe drinking water for First Nations. We have to have a terms of reference that's approved by AFN and by the government. Start the national regionally led engagement process initiated. We've done the pre-engagements, as I mentioned, and also starting on this current set of engagements. We're already halfway through it. And develop some expert videos to provide some more context by experts on these key topics. In the long term, in the 6 to 24 months leading up to 2022, proceed with co-developing the draft framework. And underlying that, there is a desire to co-draft the legislation afterwards. But in the meantime, co-develop the draft framework within the terms of reference. Presentation of a draft framework to the Chiefs Assembly, and we'll see when that next opportunity will be. Submission of a draft framework to Cabinet via another co-developed MC as a basis for drafting instructions. New legislation passed by the government, possibly targeting around mid-2022, I would imagine. And then upon ratification, advocacy and support for regional regulatory development to implement. And that's a very important part of this discussion. Is really what happens after that. How do regions begin to look at regulatory development from a regional perspective? So that's these. I Okay, so I take over, Delaney or Kerry, prepare yourself for the next few slides. Anyway, before I move on, any questions? Facilitator, Matt?
Yeah, I'm looking to my participants. So on your screen, you'll notice the reactions button at the bottom right. And there's the raise hand function that you can use so I can see if anyone has a question. Or if you have your camera on and you wave at me like crazy, then I know you have a question as well. All right, I don't see any questions. It's very, very comprehensive. Est-ce qu'il y a des questions pour Bing?
Any questions for Irving?
Given one little chance thing that we do have interpretation, could take a few seconds for everyone to get the full message. I see no questions. Oh, I see one question. There was a hand up. There was a hand up, and now my screen keeps flipping around. Oui, Monsieur Loisel. Votre microphone, ouais, sera pas long. Oh, vas-y, Monsieur Loisel. Vas-y, excusez-moi.
Oui, est-ce que ça a des questions transfrontalières?
So for the trans-border issues, does this address the issues with our neighbors in the United States?
Bing, do you want to?
I didn't catch that first part of it. I was switching over to the translation.
J'étais en train de.
It was around the transgovernmental or transboundary conversation, and does it include a conversation around our neighbors to the south, the Americans?
Definitely, that's the part. That's one area that we will be discussing transboundary issues. Not only with the provinces and territories, but those areas where there are transboundaries, in particular the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence. What are the protections that need to be afforded within the legislation? What can we put into the legislation? And when we get into that discussion, we will be listening closely what your views are, what your recommendations are, what should go into the legislation. So it is a part of that. It's recognized. It will be a difficult discussion, no doubt, of bringing in our neighbors to the south and our neighbors on each side in other provinces and territories. And that will be also a discussion that is being thrown into this middle of this discussion, the Canada Water Agency, which is being thrown as a wrench right in the middle of our activity here. What will a Canada Water Agency look like? How do we get involved? How do First Nations get involved in that discussion? Thank you.
Other questions? Autre question? Oui,
Other questions?
Bonjour, Guy.
Guy, go ahead. Okay, good morning, everyone. So just to add on to Mr. Irving Leblanc's presentation, if everything goes as expected, yes, we have planned a law maybe somewhere around 2022. And maybe just remind everyone that starting in 2022, everything's not going to be over. We will certainly start off a new process which has to do with bylaws and regulations. So if we do have a law that's similar to what we had in 2013, these laws are habilitating laws. They give the government the power to adopt different bylaws so that they can go through those bylaws for management and control issues. We're not at the end per se. There are other steps that will come after 2022. And that was one of the biggest points about 10 years ago when There were discussions on this subject already. We hope that First Nations be at the center of this process, this bylaw process. So I think we're at the good time here to affirm that and assert that the commitments that are made on this law, we need to make it clear to the governments that the next development steps need to be a joint development process. Thank you. Thank you, Guy. Any other questions or comments?
Other questions, thoughts? I'm checking my video screens for those who are waving at me. I don't see anybody. Okay, with that, I'll go to Delaney Murphy's from the Assembly of First Nations, who's a policy analyst there, to take us through the conversation that has taken place so far on our first discussion item, which is rights and responsibilities. Delaney.
All right, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Bonjour, bon matin à tous. Carrie, feel free to jump in too if you want to add anything, but I can start us off. So, as being mentioned in our 2019 preliminary engagements, we came to the regions with a lot of options and presented them some pretty challenging and sometimes complex topics. So our focus then was giving the regions a sense of our approach, and now we're coming back as we'd like to develop some further certainty as to what First Nations want in this legislation. So to begin, we're going to start with rights and responsibilities. So you can see that in 2019, when we went out to the regions, we presented them with 3 options. Sorry, I'm just going to have to get pretty close to be able to read this. But so option one was to not characterize Aboriginal rights to water in the legislation whatsoever. And this was not favored in any region. So we're not even going to be talking about this one anymore. We're going to be focused more on option 2 and option 3. So option 2 would be to characterize Crown and First Nation water rights directly in the legislation. So this would provide some certainty to all parties. It would provide a clear link between the rights and responsibilities of the Crown and First Nations, and would create a clear legal standard. But some of the cons to this approach is that it would be complex to negotiate, particularly in the form of a statute with national reach. It could have significant potential for creating legal precedents and a high probability of litigation. And it risks creating a crystallization of rights and title that doesn't let them grow and adapt to new situations as we enter into new contexts. So this one was favored by participants, but it was also noted that it would be difficult to implement. And then finally, option 3, which would be to characterize Crown and First Nations rights in an aspirational form, so such as in a preamble with a strong non-derogation and non-abrogation of rights clause in the body of the legislation. So the pros to this approach would be that it's easier to negotiate, it's non-binding, and helps create some guidance for all parties involved, and clearly signals to the government that First Nations do have and assert rights over the subject matter without committing nations to the definition for all times and purpose. So it allows for a bit more flexibility and allows for it to kind of evolve depending on new contexts. But the cons to this approach is that it is non-binding, it is in its aspirational form, and it does leave uncertainty as to powers and jurisdiction. And it could be merely postponing difficult discussions that must be had at some point to ensure safe drinking water can be provided to all First Nations. So this option was favored by participants, but it's been agreed upon that it does need to be reworded. So with that context in mind, we're actually going to move into some subject matter expert videos where we're going to explain this a bit more clearly. But just to keep in mind, the question to kind of keep in mind that we're going to have in the discussion is that the new legislation should characterize First Nation water rights in a direct or aspirational form, such as in a preamble, with a strong non-derogation and non-abrogation of rights clause in the body of legislation, and no mention of Crown rights. So we're going to come back to this question a bit later. Thank you.
Thank you, Delaney. So what we'll do, we're now going to go into breakout sessions. We're going to hear the video, and then we'll have our breakout conversation, and we'll reconvene here in plenary. I have it 20 after, but I'm going to go, we're about 10 minutes late. So what if we were to go to 11:30 to reconvene here in plenary, Evan, so that we can take a break in the groups at around 11 or 20. So it gives us a little half hour to have a conversation or listen to the video and have a conversation in our group. And we'll reconvene here in plenary to hear our outcomes from our conversation at 11:30. Evan, sounds good?
Okay,
Everyone?
sounds good. I'm opening up the rooms right now. Anybody who's left over, you can just put your what your language preference is in the chat box, FR or EN.
With that, I didn't introduce Melissa. We're into breakout groups. I didn't even introduce Melissa, our facilitator for the English group. So I'm sure she introduced herself, and so I did want to apologize for that, Melissa, for not introducing you before the session breakout. What we can do is welcome back, everyone. Hopefully you had a good conversation in your breakout groups. What I'd like to do is, first, I want to bring everyone to we have 4 kind of questions. There was a plenary question around how important is the repeal and replacement of the Act to you? And that was our first kind of Menti poll. So do take a chance to look at that. Our second question was, as we begin to push forward new legislation, how quickly do you want to see new legislation created? And there's some questions in the Menti poll around that one. And then there was the breakout question, which was, do you agree that new legislation should characterize First Nations water rights in direct or aspirational form in a preamble with a strong non-derogation and non-abrogation of rights clause in the body of the legislation and no mention of Crown rights? Thank goodness there's a couple of commas in that sentence. And the last question, what are your biggest concerns regarding the inclusion of water rights in new legislation? Oui, Madame, si oui.
Bon, moi, j'aimerais rajouter peut-être un autre petit commentaire. Je pense que ça pourrait peut-être être important, mettons, dans la loi aussi, qu'il y ait une mention par rapport aux lacs, puis qui sont sur les 2 frontières, là, la contamination des eaux par rapport parce que les Américains polluent beaucoup les lacs. Puis il y a des lacs qui sont justement là, sur les 2 frontières, autant canadiennes qu'américaines. Puis quand il y a des communautés autochtones qui sont sur les frontières, ben, des fois, ils partagent justement ces lacs-là, là, puis ces sources d'eau-là. Puis je pense que ça devrait peut-être faire
They share those lakes, and these water sources, the lakes that are on the boundaries, there should be something mentioned in the law pertaining to the lakes that are on the Canadian territory and the US territory, because the US really pollute those lakes.
So if we can share that screen so we can see what people are saying with regards to our polling questions. All right, so this is the first one. So this legislation characterized First Nations rights with strong non-derogation rights clause and no mention of the Crown. We have a lot of blue, very little yellow, and 4 maybes. The next question, which are biggest concerns regarding the inclusion of rights in the new legislation, and that's our word bubble. And those are some of the comments, or I guess the word bubble from the small group discussions. Just so everyone knows, they were recorded. The detailed conversation we'll be part of the report coming out of these sessions. So these are just highlights in terms of what was said in the small groups, both groups, but we definitely do have all the details to develop the report. Any thoughts or comments before we move on to our next agenda item, which is gouvernance de l'eau? So our next topic, I'm looking at my participants lists, seeing any hands up, looking at my camera, see if anyone's waving. See nobody. Thank you very much. Let's move on to our second agenda item, which is governance. And I'll go to Delaney to take us through our little presentation on water governance.
All right. Merci Mathieu. Alors, on va commencer.
All right, thank you, Matthew. So we'll start.
So just like last time, we're just going to go over some of the options that were presented.
Nous allons réviser les options qui avaient.
And I will note some of the pros and cons of each of the options, as well as the feedback we received then. So beginning with option 1 for First Nations water governance institutions. So option 1 was to create a water governance approach and structure, i.e. something like a First Nations Water Commission directly in the legislation. So the pro to this approach would be that it would provide certainty and clarity to all parties. It would create or improve First Nations institutional capacity and can be structured to support local, regional, and national approaches and ensures that safe drinking water is in the hands of First Nations. The con to this approach is that if it's improperly created, it may restrict flexibility in local innovative approaches because it's really set in stone with the legislation, and it may be prejudicial to First Nations existing structures and work in progress. So again, this is kind of the more like rigid option that's created right at the beginning with the legislation. And based on the feedback we received when we presented this option in 2019, we heard that it should be an idea to consider blending this with option 2. Option 2 would be to create a high-level approach and structure for First Nations water governance to be able to grow organically at the national level using a First Nations Water Commission. So this balances certainty and clarity with options to evolve organically, so it's not set in stone, and allows some national level governance with room for local approaches. And it also helps while also addressing capacity problems. So, but a con to this approach as well is it might create a centralized system that some nations or regions don't want, and it may be difficult to negotiate and may have strong opposition from provinces and territories. So this will need to be approached carefully to ensure that any delegation of authority to a centralized commission is not used to undercut the Crown's fiduciary responsibilities and to take inherent jurisdiction and authority away from individual nations. So that will definitely need to be worked out if this is the approach that is favored. And there were suggestions from the preliminary engagements to consider blending this with option 1, so kind of like a blended approach. Option 3 would be to create an opt-in approach to exercising water governance. So this really allows for local variability in terms of readiness of First Nations. So individual nations can decide when and if they want to opt into this approach. So it really allows for the kind of the local diversities to take shape. But a con to this approach is that it could create a patchwork of systems and approaches. So this approach was somewhat favored. And then option 4 was to not engage the water governance arrangements at all in the legislation. This was not favored in any of the regions. So it's not viable. So we're not even going to be having this one on the table anymore. So it's really focused on these 3 other options. Thank you.
So our question.
So the question we're going to be discussing after we watch the expert video by Marilyn Fair, one of our legal advisors, is the new legislation should create a high-level approach and structure for First Nations water governance with an opt-in approach to be considered, and that a water commission should be explored. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we'll go into breakout groups. On retourne dans nos groupes pour voir notre vidéo. Puis
dans nos groupes, we'll go back into our groups to see our videos and have our discussions, and we're scheduled to come back at So we'll have our lunch then. So we'll go on in our subgroups. We'll take our lunch break. And when we come back at 1 p.m.
Governance conversation, we'll have our breakout groups. We'll see the video. We'll answer the questions. We'll have a lunch break in terms of our agenda, and we'll return to plenary here for a transboundary governance discussion at 1 p.m. That's what I have scheduled in our agenda. So let's go to our breakout groups and watch our video and have our discussion. And we'll see everyone back here in plenary at 1 o'clock. Merci. Bonjour tout le monde.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to wait 2 or 3 minutes to make sure everyone is back for plenary so that we can launch our discussion. I will give you 2 or 3 minutes. I think you need to reselect your preferred language. So we're just going to let everyone give them the time to come back.
On espère que tout le monde est là, tout le monde a bien mangé.
So we're hoping that everyone is here, that everyone had a good lunch. So we are back for our discussions about water. So what I'd like to do is look at the survey results. I'm looking for the answers that we got on the survey questions. Okay, so that was pretty quick. So the creation of a water commission should be envisioned. So here is the first question. Also in the chat room, you could see people are writing up their ideas in there as well. We will be keeping all of these comments for the report. So if you don't feel comfortable in the plenary to add your comments, you could write them down in the discussions box and they will be recorded. So the legislation should create a high-level approach for First Nations water governance with an with high participation. So yes, no, maybe. Number 4, there is no one for that. So the next question was, should a water commission be explored? The majority have answered yes, 1 has answered no, and 5 maybes. Next question, should governance be taken out of should governance pursue an opt-in approach? 12 have said yes and 5 maybe. So other comments, Madame Siwi has put written up 2 or 3 comments in the chat. 2 comments. The comments are written there in terms of the NAFTA, the North American Free Exchange. Also, the major impacts of water, of these water resources that are located in both countries. So the subject of our next discussion is for the transboundary discussion. So are there any other comments for the governance of water? Transboundary governance. I just want to make sure, are there any other comments or questions or feedback? I want to make sure.
Good if there's no tape.
Okay. Je regarde voir si je manque un.
I'm trying to see if participants of AFN are there. Eleni.
I am, yes.
Oh, okay. I felt lonely here without anyone from the.
I'm here.
Let's jump into our next conversation area, which is transboundary governance. Talk a little bit about what has been said so far, and then we'll watch our video as per our process. So we'll jump right into it. Hopefully everyone's back, had a good lunch, and we're ready to talk about transboundary governance, which seems to be something that is of importance to our participants. I mean, the St. Lawrence's are obviously transboundary issue there, and some lakes also, Madame Siwi has been mentioning. So let's go with our overview of transboundary governance. It's all yours, Celine.
Awesome. So as we move into this topic, we're going to be going over the options that were presented from the 2019 engagements as per usual. So option 1 is to confirm that the legislation supports First Nations exercising their jurisdiction and protect off-reserve source water through agreements made with other Crown governments. So the process approach would be that the agreements would provide sufficient mutually agreed clarity to ensure source waters are protected, but they would not define First Nations jurisdiction, just acknowledging their power to make agreements with Crown governments. This clause does not endanger federal overreach into provincial jurisdiction. The cons to this approach is that agreement is not mandatory, so it may be exceedingly difficult to negotiate with oppositional provincial governments. So this approach was somewhat favored because of those significant cons to that approach as well. Option 2, which was the most favored approach, would set out First Nations jurisdiction to protect source waters off reserve. So the pros to this approach would be that First Nations jurisdiction is acknowledged and implementable and avoids litigation to implement jurisdiction. The cons of this approach is that it's likely to be opposed by provinces and territories, and this provision would be seen as federal overreach without provincial or territorial agreement. So this is a bit of a stronger approach with definitely some teeth in it. So it would likely lead to some provincial kind of not necessarily backlash, but just like there'd be likely to be opposed. The third option would be not acknowledging First Nations jurisdiction in the legislation at all. And based on the feedback we received from the 2019 engagements, this was not favored in any region, so it's not viable. So now we're going to watch a subject matter expert video by Teresa McConaughey, who is an environmental and water focused lawyer. And the question that we're going to be looking at today would be the new legislation should clearly set out First Nations jurisdictions to protect source waters off reserve. Thank you. So we're going to move into the breakouts now.
Wait, Delaney, before you're going.
Yeah.
The only reason is that we're going to be in breakout sessions for 2 topics. So I was wondering if you can give us the overview of the funding conversation so far, because we'll go transboundary governance and we'll do funding before we come back after the break to plenary. So if you can give us a little overview of the funding conversation so far, and then we'll watch 2 videos and have 2 conversations in the breakouts.
Definitely. So for the funding and financing discussion topic, I think this one, you consider the 3 options are all still on the table, but I think they all have a lot that could be expanded on. We're really looking for your feedback and input on this one, especially. So option 1 would be to create a national funding mechanism, such as a First Nations Infrastructure Institute or something similar regarding water, to apply to all First Nations under the legislation. So this would provide some certainty and clarity to all parties involved. It's predictable, it'd be transparent, and it's also likely to get Crown buy-in. But the con would be it might not be flexible enough, and it also could be rejected by First Nations, as some of the feedback we received on this one was that it's too close to the status quo, although it was favored in some regions somewhat. Option 2 would be to create a partial funding arrangement that defines principles and approaches. So this could be a commitment to actual cost funding and asset management, but does not define the specific processes for financing. So it helps create some certainty, but still allows for that local and regional flexibility and innovation. It's not set in stone. So it could be structured as a transitional approach, while a more permanent solution and our structure continues to be negotiated. But the con is it doesn't guarantee for First Nations, doesn't create that really firm guarantee, and risk that by default administration will fall to ISK policies that have, frustrated First Nations aspirations for years and have really held up some of this really important work moving forward. So that's also something definitely to keep in mind. So this approach was somewhat favored as well. And then option 3 was not addressing financing mechanisms in the new legislation whatsoever. So this was not favored in any region. It's kind of what the legislation is now with the Safe Drinking Water for First Nations Act. There's no funding mechanism whatsoever. So this option is not viable. And for this video, we're going to hear from Kevin Page, who is a former parliamentary budget officer. And the question that we're going to be looking at is, for discussion, so the new legislation should create a funding arrangement or mechanism that defines the approach and principles, and it should include funding mechanisms that commit to funding water and wastewater in its entirety. So the true actual costs of this, and that will hopefully help eliminate competitive funding and evolve based on community needs. So it should be flexible.
Thank you, Delaney. What I would suggest, Melissa, and for our technicians, is that we go into our breakout group and we tackle the transboundary governance topic first. So what I'll ask our technicians to do is to show the first video on transboundary governance. We'll have a conversations in our breakout group. Once we're done with that conversation, I'll ask the technicians to show the second video in our breakout groups, and then we'll have a conversation around funding also in the breakout groups. And we're back here in plenary at 2:15. So we'll build in a 10-minute break there. So we'll take a break at around 10 after or 5 after. And we'll reconvene here in plenary to get the outcomes from our conversations in small groups at 2:15. We should slowly be reconvening into the plenary. think sometimes it takes a few moments to re-engage in the plenary. I think people sometimes have to re-click their language preference as they rejoin. So give everyone a few moments. How'd it go, Melissa? Were you by yourself in your group?
I have to unmute myself twice with devices here. I think our group went really well. Oh, Bing was in our group, so he was able to join.
I'm so sorry to hear that.
It made the whole group. Thank you. I had to come up with your jokes, new jokes.
All right, so welcome back, everybody. We did have 2 conversations in breakout groups. What I'd like to do is go over the polls that were taken while we were in groups, so we can share it collectively on the screen here. So we had the first round around the new legislation should clearly set out First Nations jurisdiction to protect source water off reserve. So that was our first one. Is that the first one? Yeah, okay, was that the one? Wait. I'm getting dizzy. Okay, where's the one? Where's the one I want to look at? Should First Nations jurisdiction be pursued at all costs in the new legislation despite limitations that may be imposed by provinces and territories? Do we have that question? There, this one. All right, this one here, okay. It's a tie. Not quite. Yes wins by 1. All right, the next question what are your key concerns about transboundary jurisdiction considerations? And this is our word bubble. So again, I'll let everybody know that the breakout sessions were recorded, so the details of your input and also the chat has also been part of the report. So we haven't lost any of the detail of your conversation. This is just a word bubble reflection of the conversations that took place in both groups. So that's why you see some français within the anglais. That's why so it's both groups together, some keywords that came out of the first conversation. Our second conversation was on financing, and the new poll was the legislation should create a funding arrangement mechanism that defines approaches and principles. That's this one here. There's a lot of yeses. That one. The next one was, should a national funding mechanism be created to fund water and wastewater, or is this too close to how things are currently done? See, the not sure kind of tells me we just need more information, right? It's more context, some more people perhaps don't feel comfortable to say yes or no at this point. But to me, if always that not sure or maybe tells me that people need more information or perhaps some more specific information. And the last word bubble, which is what are your key concerns around including funding and finance in new legislation? So once again, this is some key words that came out of the conversations from both groups. So that's our 2 areas. I want to open the floor for anyone as we're in plenary. I want to open the floor, see if anyone has comments or thoughts or issues or concerns with what has been or what came out of the small group sessions. So I want to open the floor for that first before I move on to the next conversation. Again, I'll look to my hands up function, and I'll look to my waving participant function, which is looking at everyone's screens to see if someone's waving at me. All right. So I guess we're ready to move on to our next conversation, which is kind of, within our small group conversation, this is the next topic that Phil really brings, with his video, really, is we did talk a lot about operators, their funding, the financing for them, those kinds of issues, capacity, those kinds of issues in our financing conversation. So I think this next one, conversation on standard and regulations, and the film from, who gives us this film? Mr.
Phil Tangi.
Bill Tangi, who is a trainer, operator, and everything. So he also brings that perspective, which is really cool. So with that, we'll go to Delaney to give us a little bit of an update on the conversation to date on standards and regulations. Delaney.
All right, thank you. So our last one of the day. So as we've kind of been doing all day, I'm going to present to you the 4 different options that we presented at the 2019 preliminary engagements, and then we can discuss further in the breakout groups after watching the video. So option 1 would be to set standards for operations that apply to all First Nations across Canada. So this would provide clarity and transparency to all parties and could allow for streamlining of standards and processes to make operations and training easier and cheaper. And this option will also likely appeal to the Crown and be able to attract buy-in on all sides. So it's the most transparent way to ensure safe drinking water and creates legal obligations that do trigger funding. Because if the standards aren't met, then it's going to cause a problem and the government will have to react to that. But a con to this approach is that nations may resist these standards as they might want to develop their own that more reflects their local context. So it's complex to create and negotiate a full body of standards. And it, as I was saying, kind of ignores the reality of different local conditions. So this option was not favored in our preliminary engagements. So this leads me to option 2, which is to define a process for creating regional or local standards. So this would balance national approaches with regional innovation and definition and utilizes the legislative reform opportunity without imposing standards on First Nations. So a con to this is that implementation costs may be high, and it does leave some uncertainty as to the actual outcomes of this approach. And it may entrench provincial or territorial boundaries and approach and apply them to First Nations. So it might not really be as much of a First Nations-led approach. So this approach was only somewhat favored from the 2019 engagements. Option 3 would be to not address standards directly in the legislation or regulations at all. So this would be definitely the most easily accomplished and does allow for nations to define for themselves their own approach. So it could be kind of when they're ready to do so. So it gives a bit more flexibility on that end. But the con to this is that it utterly fails to address operation standards, which could really lead to some damaging implications that we see now with contamination and other issues like that. So this approach wasn't favored, as it really remains the status quo with what we're currently experiencing. And then finally, option 4, which was the most favored approach, would be to define some national standards and delineate others for local and regional development. So it's kind of like that blended approach that allows for nations to develop at their own pace and that develop regulations that reflect, their local context. But there still is kind of like that national overarching structure too that they can also rely on. So if properly implemented, it can capture some of the best elements of option 1 and option 2. So that kind of blended approach. But a con to this is it might be difficult to reach agreement on what elements are national and what are local. And it could possibly lead to some regional conflict and maybe resisted by the Crown, who might ideally want to look for a more single solution. So I think there's a lot more discussion to be had on this option 4 approach today. So thank you. And as Matt was saying, the video we're going to be watching is by Phil Tangi, who offers a really interesting technical perspective. And the question that we're going to be considering for discussion is the new legislation should define some national standards and delineate others for local and regional development, and must include reference to First Nations culture, laws, and spiritual relationship with water as being important components of the development of water standards. Thank you.
Thank you, Delaney. We go once again into our breakout groups. I'm getting dizzy with this transitioning, but it's okay. We'll go into the breakout groups, we'll listen to our video and ask our questions.
The breakout groups are now open.
Just to let everybody know, we solved everything in our group. So
So we're all getting raises?
we're all good now. Yeah, we'll all get a raise. Be articulated in the new legislation just how much we'll be getting paid.
Show us the money.
Exactly. All right, I just want to give everyone a few moments because I know sometimes we want to transition when we have the right language choice. When we come back to plenary, our last conversation was obviously around standards and regulations. We did have a few questions, although we noticed a translation error in our questions, but we changed it in our group, so we're okay with our questions. So our question was, do you agree with the legislation to define national standards and delineate others for regional development and must include references to First Nations culture? Predominantly, a lot of people were in support of that. Our next, this was our word bubbles. Word little square bubbles. Those are our word bubbles in terms of our nos préoccupations concernant les normes et les réglementations de la nouvelle
Concerns
législation.
about norms and regulations. Okay.
Regulations, new legislation. And in fact, we noticed the finance conversation really lent itself to the standards and regulations conversation. So it was almost as if we already had the conversation, but thankfully we got into the standards and regs. So that was pretty good. And we brought up the whole idea of the Magpie River, which was interesting. Okay, any, so that's what we said around the polls and the surveys and the word bubbles. The Menti will still be on for a little while here, Evan, right? How long will we keep the Menti going on? Till the end of the day, till we log off?
Yeah, sure. That sounds good.
So it's there if you want to go back and vote again. I don't know if you're limited in terms of how many times you can vote, but we don't want to limit anyone's participation, so you can vote 5 or 6 times if you wish. Well, but yeah, you might have to log in as someone else. All right. With that, I want to see if there's any other questions. I want to open the floor for discussion, because one of the questions we do have as we're coming to the end of our areas of conversation is what's missing. Are there areas that you feel, we had those 5 thematic areas, but perhaps there are other areas you feel are important to discuss as we move forward? So I'm just opening my chat thing here, make sure I don't miss anything. So, and once again, we have it in our chat function here. The conversation obviously doesn't end here. The conversation is ongoing. We do have the water-o@afn.ca for any comments or questions or any areas perhaps you need more information. Do go to the website and do send an email to the Assembly of First Nations if you have any questions, issues, concerns, or even if you're looking for information. Or they might have their good source of finding past studies or other areas or stuff that's been done in the area of water. So I'll open the floor. Any other thoughts? Are we missing anything that we would have liked to discuss? Perhaps could be in the next round of conversations moving forward. So I open the floor for any thoughts you might have around the questions you have before you. What are we missing? Brendan, go ahead.
Yeah, this topic probably doesn't come up too much, but you might have it in some places where maybe some First Nations are paying for water that comes from a neighboring town, like a metered service. I remember coming across this a few times in some other meetings and topics, but I haven't personally run into one. It has come up in Ganawagi a couple of times, but it was more for an individual business or one particular service on either side of our reserve. And right at the boundary, there was a business and they were trying to be supplied by the neighboring community. So in one case, they did get supplied. They made an agreement. No problem. It's just for them only. That one particular place was more an issue of safety too. But I think if you are paying for a service and you're trying to get water and sewer services on your territory, then the question would be raised is how are you going to enforce those regulations on that outside supplier? Just a comment.
It was something that was brought up in our group too. I think it's something that happens quite a bit in communities within the province. I think Wendake was the example of being serviced by Quebec. Is that a fee for service? I don't know what the relationship is there, as an example.
Well, and this one in Gunawaga, it's just a fee for service. It's I guess the same. They're charged the same rate, I believe, is probably what a commercial establishment would be, a neighboring commercial establishment. But the other thing I was looking at was more. I think the at the time it was more looking at trying to fund water or sewer plants. And if you have a very small community, and at the time, the region described was for British Columbia, where there's a lot of topographies kind of up and down. And it'd be nice for everybody to have a water and sewer plant, but in some cases, it might not be practical. So in these cases, then they might be saying, well, okay, we could put one bigger plant and service some of these other neighboring towns and communities. That's you know, that's sort of what I meant when I said, well, okay, when it's going, if you're paying for this service. So maybe they're gonna say, okay, it's easier for us to get this town, you know, a certain town to be funded, and maybe they have good provincial, you know, politics and a good rapport with the provincial government. And then, well, why don't you just pay them to get your service, you know?
I guess the idea would be to have that flexibility in the legislation, right? You wouldn't want to cut off that, you know, option, right? You would want to be, I guess maybe we need to explore those specific kinds of details.
Yeah, Matt, speaking. So that's an exact question that has come up already, Brendan. There are, I don't know how many dozens of what they call municipal type agreements, municipal type service agreements, where the municipality is providing water to the First Nations, and the feds are paying for the rates for the charge. The most part seem to be working well. The only complaints we have heard was when the town runs short of water or during rationing situations. It's the First Nations that get the worst of it, saying, okay, yeah, we have to cut back on you because we have to look after our municipal customers first. So there's some risks to it, but for the most part, I believe it's working well, and it's something that is actually likes to see. On the other hand, First Nations want to have their own water treatment plants, so they're not depending on anybody for water. So there's the two sides to that story, but certainly something to consider. Well, how would that fit into a legislation? What are the municipalities' responsibilities to the First Nation within this legislation?
Thank you, Pete. I had Ziggy.
Oui, Mathieu, merci. C'est juste pour donner l'information à tous.
Just to give everyone information that in Quebec, for drinking water and wastewater, it's about 25% of the communities that are not under treaties that have a municipal type agreements, and about 2/3 of the communities have autonomous system for drinking water and wastewater, and there's about 10% who have an autonomous system for a service and a municipal type agreement for another service. So we have a combination. So it's about 1/4 and 1/3 of the communities that have a tie with the link with the neighboring municipality for this. It goes both ways, Guy. There are some communities that provide water to neighboring municipalities as well, in some cases. So that means we have to cut them off for conservation purposes?
In my community, the neighboring municipality takes care of our wastewater, but our potable water is also connected, and in emergency, sometimes we have to like supply the municipality with our water for fire protection. So here we have a pretty good partnership, I think.
Right. Thanks, Timothy. Other thoughts or other areas perhaps that should be explored as we continue this conversation? Maybe it's something that's happening locally and you want to figure out how might it fit in to the law or conversation here about a national piece of legislation. Might be something you're living at home that you're not quite sure if it's relevant, or so I'm opening the floor for any thoughts or even clarifications, or if you're seeking information. It'll inform the AFN too, perhaps, to look into other areas that are of interest to First Nations that they want to have as part of this conversation. Derek wanted to say something. I'm teasing. He was talking with his hands there. That's like being at an auction. When you're talking with your hands, you might be bidding on something that you want no interest in. Any other thoughts? I'm looking to my hands up function. I'm looking to my camera function. See if anyone is waving and wants to say anything else. I understand that our chief left from Lac Simon. She wasn't able to stay with us to close our session. So we're going to coming to a close of our day today. I do want to give a chance to Bing and the AFN's team to say some closing comments or share some closing comments, and even Sabrina, if she wanted to say anything from as the coordinator from the region. So I don't know, Bing, do you want to say some closing comments or thoughts?
Sure, I could. I guess the most common question we've asked when we finish these things up, what's the next steps? We did elaborate on a larger picture what the next steps are, which would lead us to 2022, but more timely. We will continue with these engagements across the country, and we are doing a parallel engagements also, as we did here, as we will do later on a long-term drinking water strategy. So for this safe drinking water or legislation discussion, our facilitators will be getting together and pulling together all the notes. We'll be coming up with more information of what we heard, what should be added to those questions, and it will further informs us on what we should be providing to our own representatives on the working group as we start to develop a draft framework. And development of the draft framework, we do have our benchmarks, the AGA, AFN AGA, AFN SCA, whatever form that will take this spring. Probably might be too soon to have something of a draft framework, but we would take that to the Chiefs Assembly and say, here's a draft framework. What do you think of it? How will you endorse it and allow us to move forward into developing, providing those as drafting instructions to the drafters? And one thing I said, we will try to get involved in the drafting of the legislation. It's something that the government frowns upon and saying, well, only we can do that. Only the DOJ, Department of Justice, can do that. But essentially, looking at what we've learned here, what new things should be added, some things that have been confirmed and firmly supported. So all this was leading up to feeding into a draft framework, and we'll need to come up before we take it to the national assemblies. We'll likely have to take it out again and say, well, here's the draft framework. What do you think of it? What's missing before we take it to the chiefs? So there's still a bit more work that needs to be done. Having to go out and say, okay, here from almost 2 years of discussions, here's what we have come up with so far. So that's kind of a plan idea of where we want to head to, and things happen where we like to happen. We might have legislation tabled in 2022.
Bien. Sabrina, je ne sais pas si vous avez des mots de fermeture ou bien des mots pour...
Sabrina, I don't know if you have a closing words, just to be very brief. I just like to thank the people for having been present today, and we'll see you tomorrow at 12:45. For those of you who will be present tomorrow, basically, you also said you'd be present tomorrow, and if you have any comments or questions, you come in, you can write to me. I'm available for everybody. And as I said, you have comments that come back on the way we work today or anything that happened. I'm here to improve. I'm young and I'm here to learn. So I'll be very pleased to improve my work and to offer better support for you. So don't be shy about sending me comments if there's anything you need. So thank you, and I'll see you tomorrow. So I'll come home. I'll call my mom. I haven't worked in French in a long time, and it showed today. I'll thank everyone. I did a national engagement on indigenous languages, and what I realized is you have to practice your language all the time. So I'm going to go back home. I'm going to call my mom as soon as I get home.
Obviously, I need to practice my French more often, but I did enjoy this, and it just, you have to shake the rust once in a while and speak in French, speak in English, both sides. So I do want to thank everyone for their participation. I want to thank Aspen for the technical supports and putting together everything for your information. I want to thank the AFN for their support in putting together this whole package so that we can have a meaningful conversation, and the AFN QL for their support. I do want to thank Melissa, who I did not introduce, but I do want to thank Melissa for facilitating the English session. Obviously, the conversation continues, afn.ca water or watero@afn.ca. The conversation continues. The reports will be posted on the sites. The videos will be posted for your information. I do not have anyone to close our session, so I'm reaching out to all of you. I don't know if anyone wants to volunteer to close our session today. I'll see if anyone might be wanting to do that. If not, I'll adjourn our meeting and wish you best in your conversations tomorrow. Oh,
Je suis là. Je m'excuse. Je m'excuse, j'essayais de me connecter.
Sorry, I was trying to connect and it wasn't working. And I was in another building, and I came into my desk and I said, geez, I hope they'll hear me. Well, Chief Jerome, the floor is yours. Thanks, everyone. Thanks. I hope that the meeting was constructive for everyone. And I'm here to present the closing prayer to keep the energy of what was said and the intent. And this, but to remind us that we're all here for the people in our community. So thank you, everybody, for having attended this session, which is just as important as the other files. Now she's translating. Now she's praying in Anishinaabe. No translation here.
Jemendo kin gegun kinagat kubun kat kunwin kin kine gegun gagjaw dingin gagjaw diminu kit kamak Migotsik the Nanogome, Chimney. Egimin emoji dots. Kaja Kpiodomot Kevin on a binna. Magaya di Madzi win. Yodmatsek. Nibikak. Mirja. Shag the seas equate giving me the Madzina. Migawin is now to wishes. Can a such Nanaki. Then which a me duck. Nibina. Kedojum Majo, Kedojum Majosset. Kedojum Magic to Kevin Winces. Me got say wicked the manovo. Me got Kagabi Kuma. Extra Gucci de Pitendaguk. Madziwin, Nibigajan Kajadek. Migoch. Merci.
Miigwech, merci tout le monde. Thank you, everyone. Do take care.
Merci, au revoir.
Merci.